There are worlds that were built for suffering, not by accident, not as a consequence of forces nobody anticipated or controlled, by design, by the specific, deliberate architecture of a world whose fundamental operating principle was that power was the only thing that mattered and that everything else, love, loyalty, honor, the small, ordinary dignities that made a life worth living, was a variable that power could override whenever it chose to. Westeros was that kind of world. It had been that kind of world for thousands of years, since before the Targaryens came with their dragons, since before the Andals crossed the narrow sea, since before the first men raised their kingdoms in the age when the world was young and the things that lived in the dark beyond the wall were not a memory or a myth but a present and immediate reality. Westeros had always been a world where the powerful ate the weak, where the good died young and the cruel grew old and comfortable, where every promise was a negotiation and every alliance was a calculation and every expression of love was also an exposure of vulnerability that someone somewhere was already thinking about how to exploit. The Iron Throne sat at the center of it all, not as a symbol of justice, not as the seat of a benevolent authority that organized the chaos into something livable, as a prize, the most dangerous prize in the world, built from the swords of defeated enemies. Uncomfortable by design, as if whoever had made it understood that the person sitting on it should never be allowed to forget what it had cost, what it would keep costing. The great houses circled it, had always circled it, Lannister and Stark and Baratheon and Tyrell and Martell and all the rest. Each one convinced in its own way that it deserved what the throne represented, each one willing to pay whatever the price was, and the price was always the same, everything. The throne asked for everything, and it gave back nothing except the temporary satisfaction of having it, and the permanent terror of losing it. This was Westeros. This was the world that had been turning on its own particular axis of cruelty and ambition for thousands of years, a world that believed it had seen everything, that had processed dragons and magic and the resurrection of the dead and the long night and all the terrible things the world was capable of producing, and had survived all of it, scarred, diminished but surviving. It had not seen everything, it had not seen what was coming. In a world far from Westeros, in a world that operated on entirely different principles, that had its own particular architecture of power and suffering and the specific ways that extraordinary human beings moved through a world that was not built to contain them, two men existed. They did not know each other well. They did not need to. What they shared was not friendship or alliance or any of the ordinary bonds that connected people. What they shared was a category. The category of beings for whom the normal rules did not apply, for whom the ceiling that ordinary humans bumped against had simply never existed. The first was a man who had killed everyone he loved to protect a village that would never know what he had done, who had carried a grief so total and so deliberately chosen that it had become indistinguishable from his identity, who moved through the world like a shadow, present and absent simultaneously, capable of things that rewrote what the word capable meant, and carrying all of it behind eyes that showed nothing except the specific, permanent exhaustion of someone who had decided that their own suffering was the price of everyone else's survival. His name was Itachi Uchiha, and the world he came from would have called him a shinobi, a ninja, words that did not begin to convey what he actually was. The second was a man who had decided, somewhere in the process of becoming the most powerful sorcerer in the history of his world, that the appropriate response to being untouchable was to be insufferable about it, who wore his power the way some people wore expensive clothes, casually, visibly, with the specific confidence of someone who knew exactly how good they were and had made peace with the fact that everyone else knew it too, who could end most conflicts before they started and knew it and found the whole business of conflict slightly tedious as a result. His name was Gojo Satoru, and the world he came from would have called him a jujutsu sorcerer, words that also did not begin to convey what he actually was. They arrived in Westeros the way extraordinary things always arrived in worlds not built to receive them, without warning, without ceremony, without the consideration that a world deserved some preparation before the rules it had been operating under for thousands of years were rendered irrelevant. The how of it is less important than the fact of it. The mechanics of dimensional crossing. Of the specific failure in the boundaries between worlds that deposited two beings from one reality into another. These are the province of scholars and theorists and people with the time and inclination to care about mechanics. What matters is the fact. They arrived, in Westeros, in a world that had been turning on its axis of cruelty and ambition for thousands of years, and the axis was about to encounter something it had no framework for, no category, no historical precedent that would allow it to understand what had just arrived within its borders. Westeros had seen dragons. It had seen the resurrection of the dead. It had seen the long night and the army of the dead and the specific terror of a threat that did not negotiate and did not stop and did not care about the politics of the living. It had not seen a man who could trap you in an illusion so complete that you experienced decades of subjective time in seconds. It had not seen a man who existed outside the normal boundaries of cause and effect, who could not be touched, not as a metaphor, literally, who had decided that infinity was not a concept but a technique, and had made it his. The great houses of Westeros were about to discover that the game they had been playing, the Game of Thrones, the endless brutal competition for a chair made of swords, had been operating on assumptions that were about to be invalidated. The assumption that power was something you accumulated through armies and gold and alliances and the careful management of information and fear. The assumption that the most dangerous thing in the world was another person who wanted what you had and was willing to do what was necessary to take it. The assumption that the rules of the game were fixed, that everyone was playing the same game. Those assumptions were wrong. They had always been wrong. They had simply never been tested by the right variables. Until now, Itachi Uchiha landed in the Wolfswood, north of Winterfell, in the specific gray morning light of a northern autumn that was not entirely unlike the gray morning light of certain parts of the world he came from. He stood among the trees and was still for a long moment, taking in the environment, the smell of it, the quality of the air, the specific sounds of a forest that was alive in ways that forests were alive. He looked at his hands, at the familiar red and black of his clothing. He looked at the trees, at the sky, at the particular quality of the light. And he understood with the calm certainty of someone who had processed impossible things before and found that the processing was possible. That he was not where he had been, he was somewhere else. He filed it. He began to assess the environment, because that was what you did when you were Itachi Uchiha. You assessed, you gathered information, you understood what you were in before you decided what to do about it. Gojo Satoru landed in King's Landing, in the middle of the market district, in the middle of the day, in the middle of a crowd. He arrived in a flash of something that the people around him had no word for, a distortion, a bending of the air, a moment in which the space he occupied was suddenly occupied by something that had not been there a moment before. The crowd scattered. Gojo stood in the middle of the cleared space and looked around, at the city, at the red keep on the hill above it, at the Iron Throne visible through a high window if you knew where to look, at the people watching him from a cautious distance with the specific expression of people who have seen something they do not have a category for and are waiting to find out if it is dangerous. He pushed his blindfold up slightly, looked at all of it with the 6 eyes, with the perception that saw everything. Cursed energy, potential threats, the layout of the city, the distribution of power. He took it all in approximately 3 seconds, then he pushed the blindfold back down and smiled. Interesting, he said, to no one, to the empty air, to the watching crowd that did not understand what he was. Very interesting. Westeros had been waiting for something to change. Had been waiting without knowing it was waiting, for something that would break the pattern, that would render the old calculations obsolete. That would look at a world built on the assumption that power was accumulated and say, no, power is not accumulated, power is what you are, and you either are it, or you are not. The great houses of Westeros were about to find out which category they fell into. The Game of Thrones had been running for thousands of years. It had survived everything. It had not survived this, not yet, but not yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence, because Westeros did not give up easily, it never had. And the people who sat in its high seats and moved its armies and played its game had not gotten where they were by surrendering to the unfamiliar. They had gotten there by finding the angle. The leverage, the specific weakness in whatever was threatening them, and exploiting it, completely, without mercy. The question was whether the unfamiliar thing that had just arrived in their world had weaknesses they could find and exploit. The question was whether the Game of Thrones could absorb two men who did not play games, who had never played games, who had operated their entire lives outside the rules that games required. The question was what happened when Westeros met something it could not outmaneuver, could not outspend, could not outarmy. Could not kill with poison or politics or the careful management of information. The question was what happened when a world built on the accumulation of power met two men for whom power was not something you accumulated, it was something you were. That question was about to be answered, in the Wolfswood north of Winterfell and in the market district of King's Landing, simultaneously, in a world that had no idea what it had just received. And no idea what it was about to become. Pay attention, because this is where everything changes. To understand Itachi Uchiha, you have to understand what it means to be born into a world where your bloodline is both your greatest gift and your heaviest chain, where the thing that makes you extraordinary is also the thing that makes you a target, where the power you inherit comes preloaded with the expectations of everyone who came before you, and the weight of everything they did with it. The Uchiha clan was not simply a family, it was a legacy, a lineage of shinobi whose eyes carried within them a power that the world had never fully understood and had never stopped trying to possess. The Sharingan, 3 Tamo in a red iris, something that looked like a design, something that was a weapon, the most sophisticated perceptual and cognitive tool in the history of a world built on perceptual and cognitive tools. It awakened through emotion, specifically through grief, through the specific neurological event that occurred when an Uchiha experienced profound loss and the brain rewired itself in response, producing something extraordinary from something devastating, which was perhaps the most honest thing about the Uchiha clan, that their power and their pain were not separate things. That one produced the other, that you could not have what the Sharingan gave you without paying the price that awakened it. Itachi Uchiha was born into this legacy. In the Hidden Leaf Village, to Fugaku Uchiha, head of the clan, and Mikoto Uchiha. His mother, he was a prodigy. That word does not adequately convey what Itachi was. Prodigy implies someone who is ahead of their peers, who masters things faster than expected, who achieves at an age that makes people take notice. Itachi was not ahead of his peers, he was in a different category entirely. He graduated the academy at 7, mastered the Sharingan at 8. Became a Chunin at 10, joined the ANBU, the most elite and secretive division of the village's military, at 11. Became the youngest captain in ANBU history at 13. These are numbers. Numbers do not convey what they meant. What they meant was that by the time most shinobi were beginning to understand what they were capable of, Itachi Uchiha had already gone further than most of them would ever go, had already seen things that most of them would never see, had already done things that most of them would never be asked to do, and had processed all of it with a stillness that made the people around him uncomfortable, because stillness like that in someone so young did not come from peace, it came from having already decided something fundamental, something that most people spent their entire lives avoiding having to decide, what he was willing to sacrifice, and for what. The Uchiha clan was planning a coup. This is the fact at the center of everything, the fact that everything else orbits, for years. Tension had been building between the clan and the village leadership. The Uchiha had been marginalized, pushed to the edges of the village's power structure, suspected of involvement in an attack on the village years earlier. The suspicion was not without basis, but suspicion treated as fact had produced resentment, and resentment, in a clan of people whose power awakened through emotion, was not a stable condition. It built into something that the clan's leadership decided could only be resolved one way: by taking the power that had been denied to them, by removing the leadership that had denied it, by coup. Itachi knew he was ANBU, he was the clan's most gifted member, he was his father's son. He knew, and he understood something that the clan's leadership did not fully understand. What a coup would cost, not just the immediate violence, not just the blood of the coup itself, the aftermath, the response, the war between the Uchiha and the village that would follow. The war that would not stay contained, that would spread, that would pull in other villages and other clans and other powers and become something that consumed not just the Uchiha and the Leaf, but everything around them. He had run the scenarios with the specific analytical precision of someone who had been thinking at this level since he was old enough to think at all. He had run them and arrived at the same conclusion every time. The coup ended in catastrophe for everyone. The village leadership came to him with an offer. The offer was the worst thing anyone had ever asked of another person. Stop the coup by eliminating the clan, all of them, in a single night, before the coup could happen, before the war could start, before the catastrophe could unfold. In exchange, his brother would be spared. Sasuke, 7 years old, who had done nothing, who knew nothing, who was simply a child in a clan that had made a decision that was going to destroy it. Itachi accepted. That sentence does not convey what accepting meant, what it cost, what it required of a person to look at the offer and say yes, to look at his parents, his clan, the people he had grown up with, trained with, loved in the specific complicated way that you love people who are both family and community, and decide that the calculation came out on the side of yes. He did it in a single night. He did it with his own hands. He did not use others. He did not delegate. He bore the weight of it himself completely, because that was the kind of person Itachi Uchiha was. If it had to be done, he would do it. If there was a weight to be carried, he would carry it. He would not put it on anyone else. He stood before his parents at the end, and his mother looked at him and said, "I know you've been a good boy," and his father said, "I'm proud of you," and they did not resist, because they understood in the end what their son had done and why, and they chose to go with dignity. Itachi carried that with him every moment of every day for the rest of his life. He found Sasuke afterward and did the second cruelest thing he had ever done. He made Sasuke hate him, deliberately, completely. He told his brother that he had done it to test his own abilities, that the clan had been worthless. To him, that Sasuke was the only one worth keeping alive, as a future opponent, as something to overcome. He put in Sasuke's mind a specific visual memory, using his Sharingan, a memory of violence, of what had happened that night, shown in a way that made hatred the only possible response. He gave Sasuke a reason to live, the desire for revenge against Itachi, because he understood that a child with nothing to live for would not survive, and that a child with a reason to hate would fight, would train, would become strong enough to survive in the world Itachi was leaving him in. He left the village, joined a criminal organization called the Akatsuki, became one of the most feared shinobi in the world, while carrying, in perfect silence, the knowledge of what he had done and why, never telling anyone, never asking for understanding, never asking for anything, just carrying it, day after day, year after year, while his eyes deteriorated, because the Mangekyō Sharingan, the evolved form of the Sharingan that Itachi had awakened through the grief of what he had done, had a cost. Each use degraded his vision. Slowly, inevitably, he was going blind, and he knew it, and he kept using it anyway, because the mission required it. The mission was always the mission. Now let us talk about what Itachi could actually do. because the biography is necessary, but the capabilities are what matter for what was about to happen in Westeros. The Sharingan at its basic level gave Itachi perception that operated outside normal human parameters. He could see chakra, the fundamental energy that flowed through living things in his world. He could track movement at speeds that made the movement look slow. He could read lips from across a battlefield. He could copy techniques by watching them performed once, see it once and know it. That alone would have made him extraordinary. That was the base level. The Mangekyō Sharingan went further, much further. Tsukuyomi, the name came from the god of the moon in the mythology of his world, which was appropriate because what Tsukuyomi did was create a world, a complete, total, utterly convincing world inside the mind of whoever Itachi made eye contact with, a world where Itachi controlled everything. Time, space, gravity, the rules of cause and effect, all of it his in the real world. Tsukuyomi lasted an instant, a fraction of a second. In the world inside the mind of its victim, it lasted as long as Itachi chose. Hours, days, he had used it to trap people in 72 hours of continuous torture compressed into a single second of real time. A person subjected to Tsukuyomi for that duration did not recover quickly. Some did not recover at all. Their minds had experienced something real. Their bodies did not know the difference between the experience of 72 hours of suffering and the actual experience of it. They broke because the mind broke, before the body had a chance to explain that none of it had really happened. Amaterasu, black flames, produced from the left eye. That burned at temperatures that conventional fire did not reach. That could not be extinguished by conventional means. That burned until the target was consumed, completely, everything. Even other fire, even water, even the absence of fuel that would stop ordinary fire. Amaterasu did not follow the rules that fire followed. It followed Itachi's will, and it did not stop until the will said stop. Susanoo, the third great technique of the Mangekyō Sharingan, a manifestation, a colossal construct of chakra that surrounded Itachi completely. A warrior made of energy standing hundreds of feet tall, armed with weapons that were themselves techniques. The Totsuka blade, a sword that did not cut in the conventional sense, that sealed whatever it pierced in an eternal genjutsu, in an illusion from which there was no return, not death. Something more complete than death, a permanent subjective reality that replaced the real one. Forever, the Yata mirror, a shield that negated any attack, any element, any technique, any force directed against it, simply negated, made irrelevant, sent away. Itachi with Susanoo fully manifested was not a person engaging in combat. He was a force of nature operating in a human-scale world. He was a mountain that moved, a storm that thought, and underneath all of it, underneath the Tsukuyomi and the Amaterasu and the Susanoo and the Sharingan and all the extraordinary things the extraordinary eyes gave him, was the genjutsu, the fundamental, base level, always available technique that Itachi had mastered more completely than any shinobi in living memory. Genjutsu, illusion, the manipulation of the target's perception of reality through the disruption of their chakra flow. Itachi could trap you in a genjutsu without the Mangekyō, without even the basic Sharingan. He had demonstrated this, could trap you through sound, through touch, through the finger movements of a subtle hand sign you did not notice him make. He could make you experience something that was not happening completely, without the tell that most genjutsu had, without the seam between the illusion and reality that a trained opponent could find and pull on to break free. His illusions did not have seams, because he was not simply creating false images. He was creating false realities, complete, internally consistent. Sensory in every dimension, realities that the brain accepted as real, because they were real, inside the mind of the person experiencing them. This was Itachi Uchiha. This was what had arrived in the Wolfswood north of Winterfell, standing among the trees in the gray northern morning, still, assessing, carrying what he always carried, the weight of what he had done. Weight of what it had been for The weight of a brother who hated him for reasons that were the most loving reasons in the world, and the specific, permanent exhaustion of someone who had decided long ago that their own suffering was not a consideration, that the only consideration was what needed to be done, and who did it, always. Whatever it was, however much it cost, Westeros had seen dangerous people. It had seen killers and conquerors and people who had decided that the world would bend to their will or break in the attempt. It had not seen Itachi Uchiha. It had not seen someone for whom the question of whether they would do what needed to be done was not a question, had never been a question, would never be a question, because the answer was always yes, always, without exception, without hesitation, without the self-preservation instinct that made most dangerous people predictable, because most dangerous people wanted to survive. Itachi had stopped prioritizing his own survival a long time ago, and a person who does not prioritize their own survival is the most dangerous kind of person there is, because you cannot threaten them, cannot bargain with them, cannot appeal to their fear, cannot use the thing that every power structure in Westeros used to maintain itself, the threat of consequence, the suggestion that resistance had a cost. That the cost was unbearable. Itachi had already paid costs that would have broken anyone else. He was still standing. He was always still standing. The wolfswood was quiet around him. The trees stood in the gray morning light, and Itachi Uchiha looked at the sky of a world that was not his, and thought, and began to understand where he was, and what it contained, and what, if anything, needed to be done about it. He did not know yet. He would find out. He always found out. That was the thing about Itachi. He was patient. He had been patient his entire life. He could afford to be patient now. Westeros was not going anywhere, and neither was he, not until he understood it, not until he knew what it needed, and not until he had decided what he was going to do about that. The wolfswood waited, the gray morning light held, and Itachi stood in it, still, as he had always been still, as he would always be still, the eye of every storm he had ever walked into, and he was about to walk into the largest storm he had ever encountered, a world of dragons and dead men and a chair made of swords, and he was going to walk into it, the way he walked into everything, with his eyes open, and his heart already decided. If Itachi Uchiha was the storm that moved in silence, Gojo Satoru was the storm that introduced itself, loudly, with confidence, and with the specific energy of someone who had decided, somewhere in the process of becoming the most powerful sorcerer in the history of his world. That humility was a virtue for people who needed it. He did not need it. He knew he did not need it. He was comfortable with that knowledge. He wanted you to be comfortable with it too. This is the first thing to understand about Gojo Satoru. He was not arrogant in the way that powerful people are usually arrogant. Arrogance usually carries with it a defensiveness, a brittleness. The quality of someone who needs to believe they are the best because the alternative is too threatening to contemplate. Gojo was not brittle. He was not defensive. He did not need to believe he was the best. He simply was the best, and the difference between needing to believe something and knowing it is the difference between a performance and a fact. Gojo Satoru was a fact. Born into the Gojo family, one of the great sorcerer clans of his world, a world where cursed energy, the negative emotional output of human beings, accumulated and concentrated into entities that fed on fear and suffering, was a constant threat. Where jujutsu sorcerers existed to combat those entities, where the strength of a sorcerer was measured by their ability to produce and control cursed energy, and where certain techniques, passed down through bloodlines, gave specific sorcerers specific advantages over the chaos they were born to fight. The Gojo clan's inherited technique was called Infinity. The concept was simple, the execution was anything. But between any 2 points there exists an infinite number of midpoints. This is mathematics, Zeno's paradox, the idea that if you keep having the distance between yourself and a destination, you will approach but never reach it, because there is always another half, always another midpoint. Always more distance to cross? Infinity is the manipulation of this mathematical reality, applied to the physical world, applied to the space between Gojo Satoru and anything coming toward him. Everything that moved toward him, every attack, every projectile, every force directed at his body encountered infinity, the infinite series of midpoints between the attack and its target. And slowed, not stopped, slowed, to a speed that was effectively zero, that reached him at a velocity so reduced that it could not cause harm. A bullet fired at Gojo Satoru reached him moving slower than a gentle breeze. A sword thrust reached him moving slower than a hand extended in greeting. A curse technique of devastating power reached him moving slower than falling snow. He could not be touched, not as a metaphor, not as hyperbole, literally. Nothing reached him at the speed it needed to reach him to matter. This was the passive application of infinity, the thing that ran constantly, without effort, without conscious activation. Simply always there, the way breathing was always there. The barrier between Gojo and the world that he had not chosen and could not turn off and had long since stopped thinking of as remarkable because remarkable things stop feeling remarkable when they are simply the permanent condition of your existence. He had been born with it, had grown up untouchable, had never experienced what it felt like to be hit, not once, in his entire life. Think about what that does to a person. What it means to develop from childhood to adulthood without ever experiencing physical vulnerability. Without ever having the thing that most human beings learned early, that the world could hurt you, that your body was fragile, that other people and other forces had the capacity to damage you. Without that lesson, most people would become monsters. Gojo became something else. He became someone who understood, at a level that went beyond intellectual comprehension into something more fundamental. That the rules that governed most people's relationship with the world did not apply to him. And who had decided with the specific clarity that came from that understanding that the appropriate use of his position was not to accumulate power or protect his own interests, but to change the world. To dismantle the systems that kept weak sorcerers weak and strong sorcerers compliant. To produce a generation of students who were strong enough and free enough to make the world better than he had found it. He taught. This surprised people, the strongest sorcerer in history. Teaching at a school to teenagers, but Gojo understood something that the power structures of his world did not want understood. That the point of being the strongest was not to be the strongest. The point was to make strength, to produce it, to spread it. To build a world where the strongest person in it was not a singular exception but the leading edge of a general elevation. He was working toward the day when he was not necessary. When the world he had built around him was capable of sustaining itself without him, that was the goal. He had not reached it yet, but he was working toward it, every day, in the classroom. In the field, in the specific, irreverent, slightly chaotic way that was entirely his own. Now let us talk about what Gojo Satoru could actually do, because the philosophy is interesting. But the capabilities are what Westeros was about to encounter. Infinity was the foundation, the passive barrier that made him untouchable, but infinity was also an active technique. He could project it outward, apply it to the space around him, create a field in which everything within a certain radius was subject to the same mathematics that protected him. He called this the unlimited void. Reversed cursed technique. Blue was the compression of space, the gathering of the void. The creation of an attractive force that pulled everything toward a single point with a violence that made gravity look gentle. He pointed it, and things moved toward the point he indicated, fast. Whether they wanted to or not, whether they were prepared for it or not, whether the laws of physics in their particular context had any framework for what was happening to them or not. Cursed technique. Lapse. Red was the opposite, the repulsion, the explosion of space outward from a point. An expanding force that pushed everything away from its origin with the same violence that blue applied in the other direction. He pointed it, and things moved away from the point he indicated. Also fast, also regardless of preparation or preference or the local laws of physics. Hollow purple was what happened when blue and red met. When the attractive force and the repulsive force were brought together and allowed to interact, the result was not simply a combination of the two, it was something else, something that erased. Not destroyed, not moved, erased. The space that hollow purple passed through ceased to contain what it had contained. The matter was not scattered or burned or reduced. It was simply no longer there, as if it had never been. He had used hollow purple to carve a line through a landscape. Everything in the line's path gone, the ground itself gone. Replaced by the specific absence of everything that had been there. A trench of nothing, stretching to the horizon. He had done this casually. With the affect of someone doing something slightly tedious but necessary. Domain expansion. Every jujutsu sorcerer with sufficient skill could expand their domain. Their innate cursed technique manifested as a closed space, a reality that they controlled. Gojo's domain was called Unlimited Void. It was the manifestation of infinity as an environment. A space in which everything was connected to everything else, in which every piece of information in the universe flowed toward the mind of whatever was inside it, all of it, simultaneously. The totality of all information, all sensation, all input, delivered at once, without filter, without sequence, without the mercy of being able to process one thing before the next arrived. The human mind, any mind caught in unlimited void, experienced everything at once. And the experience of everything at once was not enlightenment, it was paralysis, total, complete. The mind flooded beyond its capacity to respond, to process, to function. It stopped, not died, stopped. The person inside the domain was alive, and completely unable to do anything, think, move, react. They simply experienced everything all at once, forever, until Gojo chose to close the domain. He opened his domain for less than a second in combat. Less than a second was enough, against anything. He had never needed more. The six eyes, the ocular ability that the Gojo clan produced once every several generations. That saw cursed energy with a precision and detail that no other eyes in the world could match. That allowed him to optimize infinity in real time. To apply it with such efficiency that its maintenance cost him almost no energy at all. That saw the world in a way that no other living being saw it, as a constant flow of energy, of force. Of the invisible currents that moved through everything. He wore the blindfold, not because the six eyes were weak, because they were too strong. The information they processed was overwhelming without the filter. The blindfold reduced the input to a manageable level, and he could still see through it, still see everything that mattered. Just at a volume that did not constitute a constant sensory assault. Physical capability, because it would be a mistake to think that Gojo was only his techniques. He was also simply extraordinarily physically capable, fast in ways that made fast feel like an inadequate word, strong in ways that the word strong did not contain. Durable in ways that went beyond what the human body was supposed to be able to sustain. He had reversed cursed technique, the ability to use cursed energy in reverse. To produce positive energy instead of negative, to heal any wound in real time. During combat, he could be damaged and repair the damage before it mattered. He was not invincible. He had been sealed by a specific technique designed specifically to address the problem of Gojo Satoru, the prison realm, a Buddhist tool of divine sealing. Used by people who had prepared for years specifically for the moment of using it, against someone who was not expecting it. And even then it had required perfect timing and specific conditions and the cooperation of someone Gojo had trusted. That was the benchmark, that was what it took, preparation, years of it. Specific tools, perfect timing, betrayal, and even then it was a sealing, not a defeat, not a death, a sealing, because killing Gojo Satoru was not something that had been accomplished by anyone in the history of his world. This was the man who had arrived in King's Landing, in the market district, in the middle of the day, in the middle of a crowd. Who had pushed his blindfold up and looked at the city with the six eyes. and said, interesting, with the affect of someone who found the world consistently interesting. Because he was genuinely curious about everything, because curiosity was easy when you were untouchable, when the worst that could happen to you was inconvenience rather than injury. When the world could not hurt you, you could afford to be curious about it, you could afford to find it interesting, you could afford to engage with it on your own terms. Rather than the terms it tried to impose, Westeros was about to try to impose its terms, the way it imposed its terms on everything, through force, through fear. Through the suggestion that resistance was costly and compliance was survival. Gojo Satoru had never complied with anything in his life, had never found force threatening. Had never experienced fear in the way that force required in order to work, because fear required the possibility of being hurt, and he had never been hurt, not once, in his entire life. King's Landing was a city that ran on fear, that used it as a currency, as a tool, as the fundamental mechanism of its power. It had met its match in a man in a blindfold who was smiling. Who was always smiling because the world was interesting, and he was in it, and nothing in it could touch him, and that was, when you thought about it, a genuinely wonderful situation to be in. King's Landing did not know that yet. It was about to find out, the hard way, the only way Westeros ever learned anything. The Wolfswood had a specific quality of silence, not the silence of a place where nothing lived, the opposite, the silence of a place so full of living things that the living things had learned to be quiet, had learned that noise was a liability, that the forest rewarded stillness and punished carelessness. Itachi understood that immediately. He had grown up in a world where the same principle applied, where the shinobi who survived were the ones who had internalized the lesson that presence was a choice, that you could move through the world leaving no trace, or you could move through it announcing yourself, and the difference between the two was often the difference between alive and not. He stood among the trees and breathed the air of a world that was not his, and catalogued what the air told him: cold, clean in the specific way that northern air was clean, pine and earth, and the particular smell of a forest that had been forest for a very long time. No chakra signatures, that was the first significant data point. He had extended his senses outward the moment he had stabilized after the crossing, looking for the familiar indicators. The specific quality of chakra in the environment, in the living things around him, in the soil, in the air itself, and found nothing, not the absence of life, the absence of chakra, which were not the same thing. Life was everywhere, the forest was full of it, birds in the canopy, small animals in the underbrush, the specific biological activity of a living ecosystem, doing what living ecosystems did, but no chakra, which meant either that this world did not operate on chakra, or that the chakra here was so fundamentally different from what he was accustomed to sensing that his perception could not register it, either way. Significant, he filed it. He began to move through the forest, south, because south was toward the sounds he could hear at the edge of his perception, faint, human sounds, the specific acoustic signature of a settlement, activity, movement, the distant sound of metal on metal that suggested either construction or conflict. He moved without sound, force of habit, force of training, force of 20 years of being someone whose survival depended on not being heard. The forest passed around him like water around something that had learned to move with the current rather than against it. He reached the tree line and stopped and looked at Winterfell. He had seen fortified structures before, had operated in and around them, had assessed their defensive capabilities and their vulnerabilities and their sight lines and their patrol patterns with the automatic efficiency of someone for whom tactical assessment was as natural as breathing. Winterfell was not the largest fortified structure he had seen, it was not the most technically sophisticated, but it had something that the structures he was accustomed to did not have: age, the specific quality of something that had been standing for so long that it had become part of the landscape, that the land had grown around it and into it until the distinction between the structure and the ground it stood on was not entirely clear. Stone walls that had absorbed centuries of northern weather and were the color of the sky above them. Towers that rose with the specific confidence of things that had risen before anyone currently alive had been born and expected to be rising when everyone currently alive was gone. It was a place that understood permanence, that had been built by people who understood permanence, who had built not for their own lifetimes but for the lifetimes after. Itachi looked at it for a long moment, then he looked at the people moving around it, soldiers on the walls, workers in the yard, the specific purposeful activity of a settlement that was functional and organized and operating on rhythms that had been established long before any of the individuals currently maintaining them had been born. He watched, for 20 minutes, without moving, without being seen, mapping the patrol patterns. The sight lines, the gaps, the specific places where the organized activity had seams, where you could move through without being observed. If you were very good at moving without being observed, he was very good at moving without being observed, he had decided. In the 20 minutes of watching, what his first action in this world would be, not confrontation, not announcement, information. He needed to understand where he was, what the power structures were, what the conflicts were, what the world he had arrived in was actually like beneath the surface of what he could see from the tree line. And the most efficient way to gather that information was to find someone who had it and listen to them, without them knowing he was listening. He moved toward Winterfell, through the seams, in the early morning light that was just bright enough to see by and just dim enough to move through without being obvious. He was over the outer wall before the nearest patrol had completed its turn, inside the yard before the next one began, in the shadows of the main keep's exterior before anyone in Winterfell had any reason to think that anything had changed. He found a window, an open one, on the second floor, through which voices were coming. He listened for a long time. He did not understand the language immediately, but language was a pattern, and patterns were something his mind was built to find. He had learned 3 languages to functional fluency in his life, each time by immersion, by listening, by building the pattern from the ground up. Starting with the sounds, then the words, then the grammar, then the meaning, he began building the pattern. It would take time. He had time. He was patient. He had always been patient. In King's Landing, things were moving faster because Gojo Satoru did not do patience, not as a practice, not as a virtue. He respected patience in others, recognized it as a genuine skill. He simply did not have the temperament for it himself. He wanted to know things now. He wanted to understand where he was now. He wanted to engage with the interesting new world he had arrived in now. The crowd that had scattered when he arrived had not gone far. People who scatter from something strange do not always leave. Sometimes they stop at a safe distance and watch. Because the thing that scared them is also the most interesting thing that has happened today, and interest is a powerful force. Gojo looked at the watching crowd, at the faces, at the specific mixture of fear and fascination that he had seen on faces his entire life. The faces of people encountering something outside their categories. Something that did not fit the boxes they had built to organize the world. He pushed his blindfold up, looked at them with the 6 eyes, saw the absence of cursed energy. Saw the specific quality of a world that ran on different principles than the one he came from. Saw the city around him as a landscape of physical force and political pressure, and the specific atmospheric weight of a place that had been running on fear for a very long time. He pushed the blindfold back down and walked toward the nearest person who had not run. A boy, 12, maybe 13, selling bread from a basket. Who had stayed because the bread was his livelihood, and leaving it meant losing it, and losing it meant consequences that outweighed even the strangeness of what had just appeared in the market. Gojo crouched in front of him, which was somewhat ridiculous given his height. He was very tall. Crouching brought him closer to the boy's eye level, but the geometry was still awkward. He did not care about the geometry. He pointed at himself. Gojo, he said. The boy stared at him. Gojo pointed at the boy. The boy, after a moment that contained the entire calculation of whether speaking to this person was more or less dangerous than not speaking to them, said his name. Gojo, Gojo said again, pointing at himself, then pointed at the boy and said the boy's name back to him. The boy nodded, slowly. With the careful quality of someone deciding that this was not the strangest thing that had ever happened to them. It probably was, but deciding otherwise was a functional coping strategy. Gojo straightened up, looked at the bread in the basket, looked at the boy, looked at the red keep on the hill above the city. He pointed at the red keep, made a questioning gesture. The boy looked at the red keep, and said something. The word came with a specific quality, the quality of a word that carried weight, that had associations. That meant something beyond its literal content. Gojo filed it. He pointed at the red keep again, made a different gesture. Who, the boy understood, said another word. With a different quality, the quality of a name, of a specific person. Gojo filed that too. He was building the same thing Itachi was building, the pattern, the language. The understanding of where he was just building it faster and more visibly, and with considerably more interaction with the local population. By midday, Gojo had spoken to 14 people, had acquired a rough working vocabulary of the local language, had eaten 3 meat pies from a vendor who had charged him, and then stood in stunned silence when Gojo had paid with a coin that was not any coin the vendor had seen before. Had walked through 6 of the city's districts. Had been followed by a growing collection of people who were not sure what he was but had collectively decided that watching him was more interesting than whatever else they had been doing. And had developed from the fragments of language and gesture and observation a preliminary picture of King's Landing, a city, the largest in the region, seat of a ruler. Currently occupied by a family whose name he had heard enough times to identify as significant. Lannister. The word carried the same quality as the name of a powerful clan. The specific resonance of something that people said carefully, with awareness of who might be listening. He had walked past 3 instances of city guards who had looked at him. Who had made the calculation? Cersei Lannister had a specific relationship with power. She had been studying it her entire life, not as an abstraction, not as a philosophical concept, as a practical reality, as the thing that determined whether you lived or died, whether the people you loved lived or died, whether the world bent to you or broke you. She had learned about power from her father, Tywin Lannister, who had understood it better than almost anyone in the history of Westeros, who had built it and maintained it and used it with a precision that made the word ruthless feel inadequate, who had taught her, by example if not by explicit instruction, that power was not given, was not inherited in any meaningful sense, was taken, maintained, defended with everything available, without sentiment, without the weakness that sentiment, introduced into decisions that needed to be made clearly. She had learned from him, and she had learned things he had not taught her, things she had learned on her own, in the specific school of being a woman in a world that gave women power only as a function of the men they were attached to, that took the power back when the men were gone, that required her to be twice as precise and twice as ruthless and twice as willing to do what needed to be done, because the margin of error available to her was half what it would have been for a man. She had learned, she had survived. She had outlasted everyone who had underestimated her. She had built something in the wreckage of everything that had tried to destroy her, a position, a power, a grip on the Iron Throne that had cost her everything she had ever loved, and that she was not going to release, for anything, or anyone. She had spent 3 days assessing Gojo Satoru, 3 days of conversations, of observation, of sending Qyburn to study him, of having the mountain present in every room where Gojo was present, of watching how he responded to the specific pressure she applied, subtle ones, the pressure of being watched, the pressure of being in a space controlled entirely by someone else, the pressure of uncertainty, of not knowing what was coming, of existing in an environment specifically designed to make you feel small. None of it had worked. Gojo Satoru in 3 days of assessment had produced exactly one consistent response to everything she had tried. Amusement, not performed, not the amusement of someone who was pretending not to be affected. Genuine, the amusement of someone who found the whole situation, the watching. The mountain, the controlled environment. The subtle pressures, genuinely entertaining, as if she was doing something interesting, rather than something threatening, as if the difference between the two was not something he recognized, or rather, as if he recognized the difference, and found the threatening version so far below the threshold of things that actually threatened him, that it registered as interesting rather than dangerous. That was the conclusion Qyburn had reached. After 3 days, he had come to her on the third evening, with the specific expression he wore when he had information that was significant and uncomfortable. He is not pretending, Qyburn said. Explain, Cersei said. The indifference to threat, Qyburn said. It is not a performance. It is not a technique. It is his actual relationship with the concept of threat. He does not experience threat the way we experience threat, because the things that create threat, the possibility of physical harm, the possibility of loss, the possibility of consequences for non-compliance do not apply to him in the ways they apply to everyone else. He cannot be harmed, Cersei said. I believe that is correct, Qyburn said. By anything we have, by anything I have observed us try. Yes, Cersei was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire, at the specific quality of firelight on the walls of the Red Keep. What does he want? She said. That is the most interesting part, Qyburn said. I believe he wants nothing. Everyone wants something. He wants to understand, Qyburn said, and to be useful. I think in the specific way of someone who is very capable and finds capability without application unsatisfying. He is not here for power, not for gold, not for position. He is here because he arrived here and has decided to engage with what he found. Cersei looked at Qyburn. And if I tried to remove him, Qyburn was quiet for a moment. I would not recommend it, he said. I am not asking for a recommendation, Cersei said. I am asking what would happen. Qyburn looked at the fire. I believe, he said carefully, that nothing would happen to him, and that a great deal would happen to whatever we used to try. Cersei absorbed that. She had built her power on the ability to threaten, on the credible promise of consequence for non-compliance. She had threatened kings, had threatened the High Sparrow, had threatened everyone who had ever stood between her and what she needed, and when the threats had not been enough she had acted. Wildfire under the sept of Baelor. The elimination of everyone in the building, the specific catastrophic response to a threat that could not be managed any other way. She looked at the fire, and thought about Gojo Satoru. About a man who could not be threatened, could not be harmed, could not be managed, who was in her keep, in her city, because he had decided to be, and who would leave when he decided to leave. And there was nothing she could do about either decision. She did not like that. She had not liked anything in a very long time, but she especially did not like that. On the 4th day she made a decision. If he could not be threatened, and could not be harmed, and could not be managed, then he needed to be used. She summoned him to the throne room, which was the specific setting she used when she wanted to communicate the full weight of what she was, the Iron Throne behind her. The room arranged to maximize the psychological effect of her position, the guards positioned to reinforce it. Gojo entered the throne room, looked at the arrangement, and smiled. With the specific quality that she had come to recognize in 3 days, the smile of someone who appreciated the effort without being affected by it. You've been thinking, he said. I always think, Cersei said. About me specifically, Gojo said. Sit down, Cersei said. I'm good standing, Gojo said, with a quality that was not defiant. That was simply comfortable. The quality of someone who stood because standing was what they felt like doing, and sitting would require a reason. That had not been provided. Cersei looked at him, at the white hair, at the blindfold, at the smile. I have enemies, she said. Most powerful people do, Gojo said. I want them removed, she said. I assumed you were building to something like that, Gojo said. You've been studying me for 3 days. And, Cersei said, and what do I get, Gojo said. Not with the specific quality of someone negotiating from need. With the quality of someone who was curious what the answer would be, as if the answer was interesting regardless of what it was. Whatever you want, Cersei said. Within reason, she added. Gold, Gojo said. Yes, land, possible, a title, if you want one, Gojo looked at her. With the 6 eyes behind the blindfold, seeing everything she was, the exhaustion, the intelligence. The specific quality of someone who had been fighting for so long that fighting had become indistinguishable from existing. Who are these enemies? He said. She told him, Daenerys Targaryen. Her dragons, her armies, the specific threat that had been moving toward King's Landing, that had been delayed by the events in the north, but that was still coming. Gojo listened. Dragons, he said when she finished. Yes, Cersei said. I've never seen a dragon, Gojo said, with genuine interest, the interest of someone who found the concept of dragons fascinating. And was now being told that dragons were real and available to observe. They are not for observation, Cersei said. They will burn King's Landing. Probably, Gojo agreed. Unless someone stops them, yes, Cersei said. Unless someone stops them. Gojo was quiet for a moment. I have a question, he said. Ask it, Cersei said. If I stop them, Gojo said. What happens to the people with the dragons? They are my enemies, Cersei said. I understand that, Gojo said. I'm asking what you intend to do with them. Cersei looked at him. With the specific assessment of someone trying to understand what the question was actually asking, what it was actually about, they will face justice, she said. In the specific tone of someone saying a word that meant something different from what the word usually meant. Gojo heard the tone. Define justice, he said. Cersei was quiet. I will stop the dragons, Gojo said, and the armies. But I will not be used to kill people who have not done anything I consider worthy of death. He pushed his blindfold up slightly. Looked at her with the 6 eyes, and I will know, he said, if that is what you intend. Cersei looked at the 6 eyes, at the eyes that saw everything. That looked at her and saw not the queen, not the performance, not the carefully constructed presentation of power, but the person, everything the person was. She pushed the blindfold down. The armies will be stopped, she said. The dragons will be stopped. The people leading them will negotiate. The word negotiate carrying in it everything it needed to carry, and nothing more. Gojo pushed his blindfold back down and smiled, not the amused smile, a different one, the smile of someone who had gotten the answer they needed. Even if it was not exactly the answer they had wanted, even if it required watching, monitoring, the specific vigilance of someone who had agreed to work with a person they did not entirely trust. And intended to make sure the agreement was honored. All right, he said, tell me when they arrive. They arrived 3 days later, the Targaryen forces. Moving on King's Landing from the north, delayed by the events at the wall, by the death of one dragon in the north. By the specific disruption that the Night King's fall had produced in the strategic calculations of everyone in Westeros, but arriving, because Daenerys Targaryen did not stop, had never stopped. Would not stop until she had what she had come for, the Iron Throne, or until something stopped her. Gojo was on the walls of King's Landing when the dragons appeared on the horizon. 2 of them moving through the sky with the specific grace of things that had been flying since before the city below them existed. He looked at them with the 6 eyes. Saw the fire building in them, the specific energy of something about to release a force that would unmake stone and flesh with equal indifference. He felt something he had not expected to feel. Watching the dragons, something that was not the tactical assessment he had been running, not the calculation of what he was about to do, something simpler, awe, pure and uncomplicated. The specific response of someone encountering something genuinely magnificent, something that the world should not have contained and did, and was better for containing. He stood on the wall and looked at the dragons. and felt for a moment that this world, this brutal, cruel, magnificent world of ice and fire and the endless human capacity for both greatness and atrocity, was genuinely extraordinary. Worth being in, worth engaging with, worth whatever it cost. Then the dragons breathed fire, and the fire came toward the walls, and the moment ended, and Gojo went to work. Infinity expanded. Not the passive application, the active projection outward from the walls into the airspace around the city. The mathematical reality of infinite midpoints applied to the space between the dragon fire and the city below. The fire hit infinity and slowed, the way everything slowed against infinity. To a speed that was effectively zero, the dragon fire hung in the air before the walls of King's Landing, moving, but so slowly that it was not moving in any way that mattered. A wall of frozen fire, suspended, between the dragons that had produced it and the city it had been meant to destroy. The people on the walls looked at it, at the fire that was not moving. With the specific expression of people who had seen many things and had not seen this, the dragon riders looked at it, also with the expression of people who had not seen this. The dragons looked at it and did something that dragons did not typically do. They hesitated because dragons understood fire. Fire was their element, their nature. Their primary tool and weapon and expression of what they were, and the fire was not moving, which was not something that had happened before, which required assessment. Even from creatures that were primarily instinct and power, Gojo looked at the dragons. From the wall, he considered his options. He could stop the fire indefinitely, could maintain the infinity field over the entire city, could make King's Landing effectively invulnerable to dragon fire for as long as he chose to maintain it. But that was not a solution. That was a delay. A solution required the people on the dragons to make a decision, to understand that the city was not going to fall, that the fire was not going to work, that the armies below them were not going to break the walls, that the path they were on had reached the end of what it could produce, and that there was another path. One that did not require burning. He pushed his blindfold up, looked at the dragons with the 6 eyes, saw the riders, saw Daenerys Targaryen on the larger dragon. Saw the specific quality of her, the exhaustion, the grief, the weight of someone who had been carrying a purpose for so long that the purpose had become heavier than the person carrying it. He saw the specific quality of someone who needed to be shown something, not told, shown. He stepped off the wall into the air, which was possible for Gojo Satoru, because infinity applied to gravity as it applied to everything else. He stood in the air before the walls of King's Landing, between the city and the dragons. In the specific space where the frozen fire hung, he looked at Daenerys. She looked at him, standing in the air, between her dragons and her target. With the specific quality of someone who had put himself there because it seemed like the relevant place to be, rather than because it was safe, or because he had been told to. He raised one hand. Not in aggression, in greeting, the specific gesture of someone who was saying, "I see you, I know what you are carrying, I know what you want, and I am asking you to stop." Not because you cannot win, but because winning this way costs something you cannot afford to lose. Daenerys looked at the man standing in the air, at the frozen fire around him, at the walls of a city that had not fallen, and felt something she had not expected to feel. In this moment, in this place, she felt seen, not the seeing of an enemy assessing a threat. The seeing of someone who looked at her and understood what they were looking at, without the interpretation, without the agenda, simply, clearly. She pulled her dragon back 1 degree. Then another, not retreat, assessment, the specific pause of someone who has encountered something unexpected and is deciding what to do with the unexpected. Gojo kept his hand raised. Patient, waiting, with the specific quality of someone who had all the time available and was willing to use however much of it was needed. The frozen fire hung between them. The city was quiet, the armies below were quiet, Westeros was quiet, in the way it was quiet when something was happening, that nobody had words for yet, but that everyone could feel. The specific quality of a moment, that was going to be remembered, long after the people in it were gone. Long after the city had changed and the dragons had passed and the Iron Throne had become something different from what it was. The moment when a man stood in the air between two sides of a war and asked with his hand, simply, without demand, whether it had to continue. Daenerys looked at him for a long time, then she descended, slowly, to the ground before the walls. And the other dragon followed, and the army stopped, and Gojo came down from the air, and landed before her, and pushed his blindfold up, and looked at her with the 6 eyes. And said, in imperfect Westerosi that had improved significantly in 7 days of immersion, "Tell me what you actually want, not what the Iron Throne represented. Not what the conquest would prove, not the political and strategic layers, what she actually wanted." Underneath all of it, Daenerys looked at him, at the eyes that saw everything. And said something that she had not said to anyone in a very long time, the truth, the specific, unmanaged, unstrategic truth of what she was, and what she wanted. And what she was afraid of, and what she had already lost, and what she was afraid of losing, and Gojo listened. With the complete attention of someone for whom listening was not a passive activity, but an act of genuine engagement, of genuine interest, in the person in front of him, in what they were. And what they needed, and what the world needed from them. Cersei was watching from the walls. With the specific expression of someone watching a situation develop in a direction they had not planned for, had not wanted, and could not stop, the negotiation, that was not supposed to happen. That she had not agreed to, that Gojo Satoru had decided was the appropriate next step, regardless of what she had agreed to, regardless of what she wanted, regardless of everything. Because Gojo Satoru did not work for Cersei Lannister, had never worked for Cersei Lannister, had been in her city on his own terms from the beginning, and would continue to be on his own terms until he decided otherwise. She looked at the man standing before the Dragon Queen, in the space between the armies, in the space between what had been about to happen and what was now happening instead, and felt something she almost never felt. The specific sensation of being outmaneuvered, not by an enemy, not by someone playing the game. By someone who was not playing the game at all, who was doing something else entirely, something she did not have a name for, something that was producing an outcome she had not anticipated and could not reverse. She looked at the Iron Throne, at the swords, at the specific uncomfortable structure of the thing she had given everything for. And felt for the first time in a very long time, the specific cold sensation of uncertainty about whether the thing she had given everything for was still going to be hers, when this was over. Whatever over turned out to mean, in a Westeros that had just received 2 visitors, who did not play the game, and were changing it, simply by being in it, simply by being what they were. And doing what they did, which was not the game, was never the game, was something else. Something that the game had no framework for and no defense against. The frozen fire was beginning to thaw, very slowly, falling toward the ground, in drops, the way ice thawed when warmth arrived from somewhere unexpected. The negotiation lasted 3 days, not in the throne room, not in any of the formal spaces that Westeros used for the kind of conversations that determined the shape of the world. In a tent. Outside the walls of King's Landing, in the specific neutral space that neither side fully controlled and therefore both sides could occupy without the symbolic weight of being on someone else's ground. Gojo had suggested the tent, Cersei had objected, Gojo had smiled, and the tent had been erected, because that was how things went when Gojo Satoru suggested them, not because he forced them, because the alternative to the tent was the continuation of a situation that nobody, not Cersei, not Daenerys, not the armies standing in the field between them, found preferable to the tent. The parties at the table were Cersei Lannister and her advisors, Daenerys Targaryen and her advisors, and Gojo Satoru, who was not an advisor to either side, who was not a mediator in any formal sense, who was simply present, because his presence changed the quality of the conversation, made it harder to perform, Harder to say things that were not true because the six eyes saw the difference between what people said and what they meant, and everyone in the tent knew that, and adjusted their behavior accordingly, which was. Gojo reflected. Most of what mediation actually was, not the formal structure, not the procedural frameworks, simply the presence of someone who could see clearly, and whose clear seeing made everyone else a little more honest, a little more willing to say the actual thing. Rather than the strategic version of the thing, the first day was the hardest, because the first day was the day when everyone was still performing. Still presenting the version of themselves they had constructed for maximum strategic effect. Cersei was the queen, untouchable, certain, in possession of everything. Daenerys was the rightful heir, just, inevitable, the restoration of what had been wrongfully taken, both of them presenting versions of themselves that were not false, but were not complete. Gojo let them perform, for most of the first day, because performance had its own information. What people chose to present was always a data point about what they were afraid of. What they needed others to believe, what the gap was between the presentation and the reality. He watched the gap in both of them. And on the evening of the first day, when the formal session had concluded and the parties had retired to their respective sides of the neutral space, he sat alone in the tent. And thought about what the gap said. Cersei's gap was between the certainty she performed and the fear underneath it, the specific fear of someone who had lost everything they loved. Who had nothing left to lose except the power itself, and who had made the power the reason for everything, who had decided that the power justified the losses. That having it was the proof that the losses had meant something, that giving it up would mean the losses had meant nothing, which was not a strategic position. It was a grief position. A person holding onto the last thing that connected their suffering to a purpose, and calling the holding on by the name of power, when what it actually was survival. Daenerys's gap was different, between the righteousness she performed and the exhaustion underneath it, the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a purpose for so long. That they could no longer clearly see the purpose, could only see the carrying, who had started with a vision of what she was fighting for. And had, over years of fighting, lost the clarity of the vision, while retaining the intensity of the fight, which was the specific danger of a certain kind of person. The kind who were capable of extraordinary things, and who in the process of doing the extraordinary things, lost track of why they were doing them, and kept doing them anyway. Because the doing was all they knew, both of them, in different ways, were not fighting for what they said they were fighting for, not anymore. They were fighting because they had been fighting for so long, that stopping felt like dying. Gojo sat in the tent and thought about that, and thought about what it would take. To show both of them what they were actually doing, and what they actually needed, which was not the throne, had not been the throne for a long time. The throne was the symbol. The thing they were using to organize the need, that was not actually about the throne. The second day was different, because on the second day Gojo stopped letting them perform. Not aggressively, not through confrontation, through questions, the specific questions that cut through the performance to the thing underneath. He asked Cersei what she would do if she knew her children were safe, if she knew that the things she had done to protect them had worked, that they were protected, regardless of the throne. She was quiet for a long time, then she said something she had not said in the presence of anyone in a very long time, something honest. Something that showed the gap between the performance and the reality, briefly, a fraction, but present. He asked Daenerys what she would do if the people she was fighting for were already free. If the world she was trying to build had somehow already been built, without her, without the conquest, what would she do then? Daenerys looked at him for a long time. And said something that surprised her. He could see that the answer surprised her, that she had not known the answer until she said it, which was the specific quality of a true answer. The kind you discovered by saying it, rather than the kind you constructed before you spoke. By the end of the second day the performance had reduced, not ended, reduced. To the level where the actual conversation had space to begin. The third day was when things became difficult, because the third day was when the actual conversation had to produce something. Had to arrive somewhere, when the specific practical questions of power and governance and what the world was going to look like when the tent came down needed answers. And answers required compromise, and compromise required each of them to give up something real, something that cost. And people who had been fighting for as long as these two had been fighting, had lost the habit of giving up anything. Had trained themselves out of the specific vulnerability that giving up something required, had made not giving up a survival strategy, a fundamental identity, the thing they were. Gojo sat at the table on the third day and watched the conversation hit the wall, the specific wall that it always hit when two people who had been enemies for too long tried to become something else, the wall of I have given too much already, I have lost too much, I cannot give more. He looked at both of them, at the wall in both of them, and said something that was not strategic, that was not mediation technique, that was simply true. The people outside this tent, he said. In King's Landing, and in your armies, and in the north, and in every part of this world that is not this tent, he paused, they are waiting, he said. Not for the throne, not for the rightful heir, not for justice or vengeance or any of the things that brought you here. He looked at Cersei, then at Daenerys. They are waiting, he said, to find out if they are going to be able to live their lives. Ordinary lives, the kind that don't get recorded in histories, the kind that don't matter to anyone except the people living. Them and the people who love them. A silence. That is what they are waiting for, he said. Not the outcome of this conversation, the consequence of it, whether they can go home, whether home still exists, whether the children they are worried about will have a world to grow up in. He pushed his blindfold up. Looked at both of them with the 6 eyes. I have seen a lot of powerful people, he said. In my world, people who had more power than either of you, and I have seen what happens when powerful people forget what the power is for. He pushed the blindfold back down. It is not for you, he said. It was never for you. It is for them. The people outside the tent, waiting. The tent was very quiet for a long time. Then Cersei said something that she had not said in the presence of anyone ever in her entire life. Something that acknowledged the thing she had been carrying, that she had never acknowledged. Because acknowledging it would have been weakness. And weakness was the thing she could not afford, had never been able to afford. She acknowledged it in 3 sentences. That contained the entirety of what she was, beneath the performance, beneath the queen, beneath the Lannister. 3 sentences about what she had lost, and what she had done with the losing. And what she was afraid the losing meant, and Daenerys listened, and then said something in return. Also 3 sentences about what she had wanted, before the wanting had become the war. About what the world had looked like from the beginning, before the carrying of the purpose had obscured the purpose itself. Gojo listened to both of them and said nothing. Because nothing needed to be said, because the conversation had finally become the conversation, rather than the performance of a conversation, and the conversation, given space, was finding its own way to where it needed to go. The agreement they reached on the third evening was not perfect. It was not the agreement that either of them would have written if they had been writing alone. It was the agreement that 2 people reached when they were both being honest. And both being asked to give something real, and both chose to give it because they had been shown, not told, shown what the alternative cost. Cersei would retain a position. Not the Iron Throne, something else, a governance role in the West, in the lands she knew, with real authority, real power, not the power of the throne, but power over the place she had fought her whole life to protect, in the name of things that were gone, but that had been real, had always been real, regardless of everything. Daenerys would take the throne, with conditions, real conditions, not the conditions of a victor imposing terms. The conditions of someone who had been shown what victory without accountability looked like, and had decided that was not the victory she wanted. The conditions were about governance. About the people outside the tent, about the ordinary lives that were waiting to be lived. It was not perfect. Nothing in Westeros was perfect. Perfection was not the standard. Survivable was the standard, and this was survivable for the people in the tent, and more importantly, for the people outside it. The tent came down on the morning of the fourth day. Gojo watched it come down with the specific expression of someone who had done something that had taken effort, but was satisfied with the result. Not proud, he had not done this. They had done this, he had simply been present, in the way that the right presence changed what was possible. He pushed his blindfold up, looked at the city. At King's Landing in the morning light, at the specific quality of a city that had come very close to burning, and had not, that was still standing, in the morning light. With all the ordinary lives inside it still being lived, he pushed the blindfold back down and smiled, the smile he had been smiling since he arrived, the genuine one. The one that meant he found the world interesting and was glad to be in it, and thought that being in it was, on balance, worth whatever it cost. The Iron Throne was going to change hands. Without the city burning, without the dragons, without the specific catastrophe that Westeros had been building toward, for years, it was going to change hands. Because two women in a tent had been honest with each other, for 3 days, in the presence of a man who could see when they weren't, and had asked them to try, that was all. That was the whole of it. It was not a battle, it was not a conquest, it was not the kind of story that Westeros usually told about how things changed, but it was the kind of change that lasted. Because it was built on something real, rather than on the specific temporary foundation of force, which always required more force to maintain, until the force ran out, as it always did. Eventually, force ran out, and what was built on it fell. What was built on honesty fell too. Eventually, everything fell eventually, but it lasted longer. And the falling was less catastrophic, and the people outside the tent got more time to live their ordinary lives, which was, in the end, the whole point, had always been the whole point. Whether anyone in the Game of Thrones had understood that or not, the Iron Throne stood in the throne room of the Red Keep, made of swords, uncomfortable, waiting, as it always waited. For whoever was going to sit in it next, and whatever they were going to do with the sitting, the game had not ended. Games like this one did not end. They changed, they evolved. They produced new players and new stakes and new versions of the same fundamental questions. Who has power? What do they do with it? Who pays the cost? And whether the cost is worth the thing it buys. Those questions did not have final answers. They had current answers that needed to be revisited constantly by whoever was paying attention. Gojo Satoru was paying attention. He was always paying attention. That was the thing about the 6 eyes. They did not turn off, could not turn off, saw everything, all the time. It was, occasionally, exhausting. It was also, he thought, standing in the morning light outside the tent, looking at the city that had not burned, a privilege to see clearly. In a world that preferred not to, was a privilege that he did not take lightly, even when it was heavy. The morning continued, the city woke up, the ordinary lives resumed. And somewhere in the north, Itachi Uchiha was walking back toward Winterfell through a landscape that was very slowly warming, and the two of them, without knowing it, without planning it, had done something that Westeros had not managed to do in thousands of years. They had interrupted the pattern, not broken it. Patterns like this one did not break, they were too deeply embedded. Too structural, too much a function of what the world was, rather than what any specific person in it did, but interrupted, for a moment, long enough for the people outside the tent to get a breath and look at the morning and decide whether this was the world they wanted or whether they wanted to build something different. That was the question. That had always been the question that Westeros had never quite managed to answer because it had never quite had the space to ask it clearly. It had the space now. What it did with the space was going to determine everything that came next. Westeros did not change overnight. It never had. Change in a world like this one was not the product of a single moment. not the product of a battle won or a throne taken or a dragon silenced or an army of the dead fallen in the northern snow. Change in Westeros was the slow accumulated weight of things that had happened, pressing down on the things that had always been, until the things that had always been shifted slightly in the direction of something different. That was how change worked here, slowly, painfully, with resistance at every stage, from the people who had built their lives on the things that were changing, and who had every reason to resist, and who were not wrong to resist, because change that came too fast, in a world built on the specific architecture of Westeros, did not produce the thing it promised. It produced chaos, and chaos in Westeros had a specific cost, paid by the people outside the tent, the ones with the ordinary lives, the ones who could not afford chaos, because they had nothing to absorb it with, so the change was slow, and the people who had interrupted the pattern understood that. One of them understood it from experience, from a lifetime of operating in a world where change had always come at the cost of something, and where the work was never finished, and where the only honest relationship with the work was to keep doing it, without expectation of completion. The other understood it differently, from the specific understanding of someone who had always been able to see everything, and had learned, in the seeing, that the distance between what was and what could be was never as large as it looked from the outside, and never as small as it felt from the inside, that it was always exactly the distance it was, and that the work of closing it was the work, simply, without decoration, the work. Daenerys Targaryen sat on the Iron Throne, for the first time, in a throne room that had been her family's, before it had been taken, before she had been born into the taking, into the exile, into the long road back to the place she had always been told was hers. She sat on it, and felt the swords beneath her, the specific discomfort of the thing that had been built to be uncomfortable, as if the builder had understood something about power that most people who wanted power did not understand, that it should never be comfortable, that the moment it became comfortable was the moment it started doing what power always did when it became comfortable. Corrupting. She sat on it and felt the discomfort, and thought about what Gojo had said in the tent, about the people outside, about the ordinary lives, about what the power was for. She had known that once, had known it clearly, at the beginning, before the road back had become so long and so costly that the knowing had gotten buried under everything the road had required of her. She knew it again now, imperfectly, incompletely, but present. The way things you had lost came back, not as they had been, as something that had been changed by the losing, and was therefore different, but real, still real. She looked at the throne room, at the people in it, at the specific collection of faces that represented the world she had inherited, and the world she was trying to build, and the gap between the two. That was her work now, the gap, closing it, millimeter by millimeter, day by day, without the dragons burning anything, without the armies breaking anything, with the specific slow work of governance, which was less dramatic than conquest, and more important, and considerably harder. She had been told that by people who had known. She had not fully believed it, until now. Now she believed it completely. In the West, Cersei Lannister sat in the seat she had been given, not the Iron Throne, something smaller, something that a younger version of herself would have found insulting, would have rejected, would have burned rather than accepted. She sat in it and found, unexpectedly, that it fit, in the way that things fit when they matched what you actually were, rather than what you had decided you needed to be. The West was hers, the Westerlands. Place her family had come from, the place that had made the Lannisters what they were, before everything else, before the Iron Throne, before the game. She governed it, with the precision and the ruthlessness and the intelligence that had always been hers, but directed differently, not at the accumulation of power, at the maintenance of the specific place, the specific people, who had always been underneath the ambition, who had always been the reason, even when the reason had gotten buried, under everything the ambition had required. She was not happy, she did not expect to be happy. Happiness was not a category she had a functional relationship with, but she was occupied with something real. Something that required what she had, and gave back something in return, which was the closest thing to what happiness was for someone who had been through what she had been through, and that she had learned was enough. In Winterfell, Jon Snow continued to be Jon Snow, which meant he continued to do the work. The specific work of someone who had died and come back and decided in the coming back that the only justification for the coming back was to use the time well. He governed the North, with Sansa, who was, as she had always been, better at governance than almost anyone who had ever tried to govern, who had learned what she knew the hard way. In the specific school of surviving people who had tried to destroy her, and had not managed it, and who had come out the other side with a clarity about what mattered and what did not. That made her formidable in ways that had nothing to do with armies. They governed together, which was not always easy, because Jon and Sansa were not the same, had never been the same. Saw the world from positions that did not always align, but had learned over years of things that should have broken them, that the not alignment was not a problem, it was the work. The specific work of two people who cared about the same things, and had different ideas about how to protect them, arguing about it. Until they found the thing that was better than either idea alone. It was not perfect, it was Westeros, perfect was not available, but it was better than before, and better than before. In a world that had been the way this world had been, was not nothing, was in fact, everything. Itachi stayed in the North for a time, not indefinitely. He had never planned to stay indefinitely. He was not someone who stayed, who put down roots, who built the kind of life that required a specific place and a specific set of people. He was someone who moved, who went where he was needed, who did what needed to be done, and then went somewhere else, where something else needed doing. He stayed in the North long enough to be useful, long enough to share what he knew, about the things beyond the wall, about the specific nature of what had lived there. About what the end of it meant, and what it did not mean, because the end of the Night King was not the end of all the things that the North contained. The North was still the North, still vast. Still cold, still full of things that the South did not understand, and still requiring the specific vigilance of people who understood what they were watching for. He shared what he knew. With Jon, with the people Jon trusted, with the specific patience of someone who understood that knowledge was only useful if it was transferable, if it could outlast the person who held it. If it could be carried forward by the people who remained after the person who brought it was gone. He spent time with Jon specifically, not teaching. Not the formal transfer of technique or knowledge, simply, in the same space, in the specific way that two people could be in the same space and learn from each other. Without either of them intending to teach, Jon learned things from Itachi about stillness, about the specific quality of patience that was not passivity, that was active, engaged. Waiting not because waiting was safe, but because waiting was the right action at that moment. And Itachi learned things from Jon about something he had given up a long time ago. In a village he had destroyed, in a night he had spent his life carrying, he learned from Jon, who had also given things up, and who had found in the giving up not peace but something. The specific quality of someone who had lost everything, and had decided that the losing did not define them, that they were more than the sum of their losses, that the losses had cost them. But had not taken everything, had not taken the capacity to move forward, to find the next thing, to keep going. Itachi sat with that for a long time, in the gray northern light. In the cold that was simply weather, now just weather, he sat with it, and did not resolve it, because some things did not resolve, they simply became part of you, and you carried them. And went forward, carrying them, because forward was the only direction available, and because the carrying was itself a form of respect for the things that had been lost. For the people who had been lost, a refusal to make their loss the end of everything, when their lives had been more than the end, had been more than the thing that happened at the finish. Had been everything that came before, which was real, and mattered, and deserved to be carried forward. Rather than buried, he was ready to go. One morning, in the gray light, he simply knew. The way he always knew when the work in a place was done. He found John in the yard. They stood together for a moment, in the specific silence of two people who did not need to fill silence. Who had learned in their different ways that silence was not absence, was not the space where things should have been said, was sometimes the thing itself, the complete thing. "You're leaving," John said. "Yes," Itachi said. "Where?" Itachi looked at the horizon, at the gray sky above the wolfswood, at the specific quality of a morning that was simply a morning. "I don't know yet," he said. John nodded. "Will you come back?" Itachi looked at him, at the eyes, at the weight. At the specific quality of someone who asked a question not because they needed the answer, but because asking it was the honest thing. "I don't know," Itachi said. John nodded again. Reached out his hand. Itachi looked at it for a moment, then took it, the handshake of two people who had stood in the same place for a while and had found in the standing something that neither of them had expected, and that neither of them had words for, but that was real as anything, in a world that was full of real things, if you knew how to look. Itachi walked to the gate of Winterfell, walked through it, into the gray morning, into the wolfswood, into whatever came next, without looking back, because looking back was not how he moved. Had never been how he moved. Forward was the only direction. It had always been the only direction. In King's Landing, Gojo stayed longer. Because King's Landing was more interesting than Winterfell, more complicated, more full of the specific human chaos that he found genuinely engaging, the politics, the competing interests. The endless negotiation of a city that was the center of the world, and knew it, and was constantly performing that knowledge for everyone around it. He moved through it. As he had always moved through it, without belonging to it, without being captured by it, present, engaged, interested but free, always free, he sat in on council meetings. Not as an advisor, not in any formal capacity, simply present, in the way his presence changed things, made people a little more honest, a little more willing to say the actual thing. He walked the streets, talked to people, the bread seller who had become over the weeks something approaching familiar, not friendship exactly. The relationship of two people who occupied the same space regularly and had found in the occupation something worth returning to. He watched the city, with the six eyes, saw its energy. Its patterns, the specific ways it was the same as cities in his own world, and the specific ways it was entirely different. He found both equally interesting. Which was the thing about Gojo Satoru, he found everything interesting, the same and the different, the familiar and the unprecedented, the beautiful and the terrible. He found it all interesting because he was in it, and being in something was itself interesting. Regardless of what the something was, he knew he would leave eventually. The same way Itachi had left, not because there was nothing left, but because there was more, somewhere else, something else that was interesting. Something else that needed the specific presence that his presence provided. He had not found the way back to his own world, had not looked very hard, he was not sure he was in a hurry. His world would be there, it was his world, it was not going anywhere, and this world was also interesting, was also worth being in, was also full of things that the six eyes found worth looking at. He stood on the walls of King's Landing one evening, in the specific quality of a sunset that the city produced, the light on the water of Blackwater Bay. The specific gold of it, that was not the gold of the Erd Tree, not any gold he had seen before, its own gold, the gold of this place, this world. He pushed his blindfold up. Looked at it with the six eyes, saw everything, the city, the bay, the light, the people moving through the streets below.